This video is all about 4 operations with fractions. So let's consider the first operation, that is adding fractions. So here I've been given 2 fractions and I've been asked to add these 2 fractions. Now, when you have to add 2 fractions, you have to remind yourself of 2 questions. The first one is, I can only add fractions if they have a common denominator. Number 2, when you add fractions, you only add the numerators. In this case, my 2 fractions have same denominator, so I can go ahead and add these 2 fractions. I will only add the numerators, so it will become 5 add 3, which is equal to 8 divided by 7. Now let us consider example number 2. Now I've been given 2 fractions again, but this time when I look at these 2 fractions, I notice one thing, that these 2 fractions do not have a common denominator. So if my fractions don't have a common denominator, I will have to find a common denominator. Now the common denominator is always the lowest common multiple. So to find the LCM of the 2 numbers, you can use this procedure. You could write down the denominators separated by comma. Once you've done that, you ask yourself, can these 2 numbers be divided by a common number? In this case, they both can be divided by 2. So I'll divide them both by 2. And if I divide 8 by 2, I'll end up with 4. If I divide 6 by 2, I will end up with 3. Now I'm going to ask myself again, can 4 and 3 be divided by a common number? Yes, that is 1, but I don't have to divide them both by 1. So what I will now do is, if I multiply these 3 together, that will be my LCM. So I'll say LCM is my common denominator. And to find it, I will do 2 times 4 times 3. And if you multiply them together, you will end up with 24. Now that I have found the common denominator, I will say this 8 will change to a 24. And the 6 will also change to 24. Now I'm going to ask myself, what did I do to make this 8 24? I multiplied it by 3. I will multiply this numerator by 3 as well. I will ask myself the same question, what did I do to this 6 to change it into 24? I have multiplied it by 4. I will multiply this by 4 and I'll do the same to the numerator. If I multiply 5 with 3, I'll end up with 15. When I multiply 3 with 4, I'll end up with 12. Now I can see my 2 fractions have a common denominator, so I can add. But remember, when you add fractions, you only add the numerators. So in this case, when I add 15 to 12, it will change to 27 over 24. Now this is my answer. But one extra thing that you can think about here is you need to ask yourself, can this fraction be simplified? I can see in this case 27 and 24, they both are divisible by 3. So if I divide 27 by 3, I'll end up with 9. If I divide 24 by 3, I'll end up with 8. And that's my simplified answer. Now let us consider the second operation, subtraction. So when it comes to subtracting fractions, it is exactly same as adding fractions. The only difference is, instead of adding numerators, you will subtract numerators. So just like I did on the last questions, I'm going to ask myself, I can see here is a subtraction sign. I will ask myself, do they have a common denominator? I can see in this case, they do have a common denominator. I'll go ahead, I'll take this 3 away from this 5, and that will leave me with 2 over 7. On the next question, again, I can see I've been given 2 fractions and I'm going to subtract these 2 fractions. But I see this time again, just like on question number 2, the denominators are different. So I'll have to find a common denominator. If you look at the last question here, you will find that the denominator of the first fraction was 8. The denominator of the second fraction was 6. So we had to find a common denominator. To find the common denominator, we did this procedure and we found our LCM to be 24. This exactly same situation in this question. My 2 fractions have denominators of 8 and 6. I'll go ahead, write down 8 and 6 separated by commas. Ask yourself, can 8 and 6 be divided by a common number? In this case, yes, it can be, and that is 2. I'll divide them both by 2. So if I divide 8 by 2, I'll end up with 4. If I divide 6 by 2, I'll end up with 3. Now I know they don't go in any common number other than 1, so I'll stop. And my LCM, which is my common denominator, will be 2 times 4 times 3, which is equal to 20. I'll do exactly the same thing that I did on the previous question, which is question number 2 on adding fractions. I'll change this 8 to 24 and I'll change this 6 to 24. Then what did I do to change this 8 to 24? I multiplied it by 3. I'll do the same to this 5. What did I do to this 6 to change it to 24? I multiplied it by 4. I'll do the same thing to the numerator. Now you can multiply 5 with 3. That gives you 15. You can multiply 3 with 4 and that gives you 12. Go ahead, because now you have got the same denominator for the two fractions. If you subtract the numerators, you'll end up with 3 over 24. Do ask a question from yourself at this stage. Can this fraction be simplified? In this case, 3 and 24, they are both in 3 times table. If I divide them both by 3, I'll end up with 1 over 8. This question marks the end of adding and subtracting fractions. Just remember two things. Whenever you have to work on questions involving fractions and you have to do addition or subtraction, you must keep two things in mind. One is my two fractions must have same denominator. Number 2, you only add or subtract the numerators. The next operation involving fractions is multiplying fractions. So if you've been given a question where it asks you to multiply two fractions, there is a procedure that needs to be followed. Can the first fraction be simplified? If it can be simplified, make sure you simplify it. I see they both are divisible by 2. So I can divide 14 by 2, that gives me 7. If I divide 12 by 2, that gives me 6. I can't simplify them any further, so I'll stop. I put the multiplication sign. I'm going to hide this section and I'm going to ask myself the same question. Can the second fraction be simplified? If it can be simplified, you must simplify. I see they are both divisible by 2. So if I divide them both by 2, it will change to 18 over 5. I can't simplify this fraction any further. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to check diagonally. So I'm going to ask myself, how about them two? Can they be simplified? In this case, I can see they can be simplified. So I'm going to simplify them. I can see 6 and 18. They are both in 6 timetable. If I divide this by 6, I'll end up with 1. If I divide this 18 by 6, I'll end up with 3. I can't simplify them any further, so I'll stop. Then I will ask the same question. Can these two be simplified? In this case, they can't be simplified, so I'll leave them like that. Now, because we are doing multiplication of fractions, you have to remember you will multiply the numerators and you will also multiply the denominators. So if you multiply 7 with 3, you will end up with 21. And if you multiply 1 with 5, that will give you 5. Now, this method will make your life easier and you will be able to solve questions involving fractions more quicker. So make sure you simplify fractions because it's much harder to multiply 14 with 36. Even I can't do that in my head. Now let's quickly have a look at the question which involves dividing fractions. I've been given two fractions again, and this time there's a division sign between them. So the first fraction needs to be divided by the second fraction. Before I work on this question, I'm going to ask myself again, can this fraction be simplified? And I can see in this case, 3 and 12 are both in 3 times table. So if I divide them both by 3, I'll end up with 1 over 4. I'll keep this division sign here. I'm going to ask the same question again for the second fraction. Can the second fraction be simplified? And I can see again, 8 and 10 are both in 2 times table. So I'll divide them both by 2 and that leaves me with 4 over 5. Now I see first fraction can't be simplified. Second fraction can't be simplified. And there's a division sign. So I'll use rule called KFC. This means the first fraction you keep as it is. The second fraction, you will flip it. And for the sign, you will change the sign to multiplication. So the first fraction stays the same. The second fraction needs to be flipped. And the sign will change to multiplication. Now I can ask myself, can they be simplified in diagonal? If they can't be simplified, I'll follow the same method like I did on multiplying fractions. I'll multiply 1 with 5, that will give me 5. And if I multiply the denominators, that will give me 16, and that is my answer. So in this video, we have seen 4 operations involving fractions: addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. I've gone through some instructions. Please keep those instructions in mind when you're working on these questions, and the chances of making error will be minimized on your exams. I hope you will find this video useful. To stay up to date with the content being published on my channel, please don't forget to click on the subscribe button, and I'll see you all in the next video. Thank you.